What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was powerless? Until a forgotten seal made him unstoppable. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Among the civilian population of the elemental nations there were many thoughts regarding the hidden villages that fell across the map. Most thought of them as simple settlements, containing garrisons of shinobi ready to leave at a word's notice from their leader. Others thought of them with scorn or jealousy, regaling accounts of their use of techniques that made the fighting force so famous, their jutsu. Few, however, believed them to be simple villages, with a bustling, vibrant life, filled with merchants calling out their wares, children running through the streets, pervaded by a general hum of activity. In the case of Konohagakure no Sato of Hai no Kuni, that was exactly what it was. Shinobi were an ever-constant presence, of course, so tightly ingrained within the ethos of life there. For the most part though, they worked in the background. Their main presence in the village was in fact the many D-ranked so-called missions that were the bane of a young genin's life. The only other place where civilian and shinobi really met was the academy, squirreled away near the Hokage Tower with the monument of Hokage's past and present looming overhead in their silent vigil. Here, children were brought at the young age of 6 to be first introduced to the life of their home's silent guardians. Slowly, over the years, they would not only learn this lifestyle, but adopt it for themselves, training their bodies and minds into the service of the village. Of course, in those early years when their bodies were untrained and their minds were filled with idle fantasies of rescuing princesses and flamboyant techniques, their studies were far more mundane. That morning, with the summer sun burning hotly overhead, there was one 6-year-old not in class. Uzumaki Naruto sat on a rooftop that gave him a prime view of the academy, a street away. At first glance, one might have thought he was skipping the class due to boredom. They would be wrong. Naruto was actually incredibly interested in the history of his village. They often told tales of the famous shinobi that had come before them and their rise to fame and power, along with the battles that brought them there. In fact, Naruto had chosen this very spot because, despite the small rebellious streak present in any child, he wanted to be caught. It would be simple enough for his sensei to notice his absence and with only a single glance out of the window, spot him sitting there, waiting expectantly. It had already been half an hour since the start of class and Naruto was still sitting there, slowly swinging his legs back and forth as his posture grew increasingly slumped and despondent. His hands clenched and unclenched beside him, making his nails click rhythmically along the tiles of the roof until he finally jumped to his feet, an irritated scowl plastered across his whiskered cheeks. Fine then Ibeo. If they don't want me, then I don't need them. The young spiky-haired blonde ran across the roof, jumping the small gap before grabbing a nearby drain pipe and sliding all the way to the ground. Many would have seen the feat and been rather surprised that such a young kid could do something so fearlessly. Then again, in Konoha most would have simply turned away once they had seen that it was that particular child. Landing in a crouch, Naruto quickly took off in a random direction, pawing at his face to remove the slight wetness that had entered his eyes. He had told himself a long time ago that he refused to cry anymore, it had never gotten him anything anyway. When the old man, that Naruto would later come to realize was in fact the Hokage himself, first told him that he would be entering the academy, his childish mind had done what so many before had done, conjured up images of death-defying missions, praise from thankful clients and many awesome jutsu to learn. However, unlike many other children that took for granted simple things that Naruto never had, like family or friendship, there was something he craved far more. As a younger child he had loved those rare days when he could walk up to a group of kids playing ninja and they would allow him to join in. Unfortunately, the next day, like clockwork, he would return, only to have them turn on him. They would either run away or tell him to get lost. He had caught more than a few suspicious or hostile looks from the parents when he approached their children, to the point where he had stopped trying, preferring to sit by himself. He would listen to their happy cries so that he could close his eyes and, just for a while, pretend he was amongst them. The academy was supposed to be different, he would be joining other kids looking to become shinobi. They would be learning together, as classmates. Those young, naive hopes had been soundly crushed within the first week. Both the children and sensei alike ignored him as if he carried some disease. At first he tried to persevere, hoping that if he showed he was good enough, like that Sasuke boy, they would see how good he was. A lot of the other kids seemed to have some training beforehand though, and there were a lot of things he just didn't understand in class. He refused to ask though, thinking it would make him seem stupid to the others. There's only so much a young child can take, which saw the blonde running away from the academy where he was obviously unwanted, just like in the rest of the village. He paused in a lonely street for a few seconds to catch his breath, considering where he should go now. A pang of guilt passed through him when he thought of the Ichirakus. His first thought had been to return to the ramen stand where he felt so warm and wanted. But Tucci and Ayame had seemed so happy when he told them about the academy, to return there just to tell them he had just given up? The idea hurt more than words could describe. A burst of determination flooded the young child. He hadn't given up yet. In a twist of fate, just as he resolved to return to the academy, walking out of the alleyway with a determined step, he managed to run into a large man going past. After a few mumbled curses, the man continued on with barely a passing glance, leaving the young kid sitting on the dusty street, clutching his head and suppressing tears. As he wiped them away, he looked up to see a large building he had only ever noticed in passing on the trip between his small apartment and the academy, the library. With a bright grin, Naruto burst to his feet with a previously hidden energy. Shibuki-sensei's words about the library flashed through his mind. He had told the class it was somewhere they could go to supplement their own learning, but Naruto had never bothered with it before as reading was difficult for him. If it helped him become an awesome shinobi that his classmates would respect and admire, he'd try just about anything. That was why around 10 minutes later he was happily walking out of the building with a stack of books that almost cut off his view of the path in front of him. He had expected some trouble from the librarian, but the bored-looking man lounging behind the desk, a chunin by his forest green flak jacket, had barely given him a second glance. It still bothered Naruto how the adults would always ignore him, as if his existence was so negligible it wasn't even worth noting. He wasn't going to complain on the rare opportunities it helped though. There was a truer than usual grin spreading his cheeks, turning his eyes into fox-like slits, as he jogged towards the training grounds reserved for academy students. There was one he was particularly fond of, that was fairly far away from the academy, because it was close to the real training grounds. Occasionally he could catch the sounds of shinobi sparring. As he sat down on the soft grass, books spread about him like petals of a flower to which he was the stem. He couldn't help but feel like this was a turning point for him. Ah, screw this, Ibeo. Naruto clutched a book on chakra theory in a white-knuckled hand held over his head. The only thing stopping him from throwing across the clearing was the librarian's absent parting words on damaging the books. Instead, he set it down next to the pile of other books he had tried to read, only to be blocked by words he didn't understand, diagrams that hurt his head to look at and sometimes even confusing titles. In later retrospect, he would realize that choosing the most advanced books he could find on the subject was a poor choice, but right at that moment he was just frustrated at his own inability. He jumped to his feet so that he could run through some exercises, figuring he could at least work on his fitness. It was just about the only thing he seemed to have over the rest of the class. He had no idea that he hadn't been alone in the clearing for some time now, and a single eye watched him curiously from the trees. "Aren't you supposed to be in school, kid?" Naruto, shocked by the sudden voice, span so fast that he managed to trip over a haphazardly stacked book pile and ended up in a heap on the floor. He ended up looking dazedly at the silver-haired shinobi staring at him with clear amusement. At least, Naruto assumed it was amusement, as the man wore a face mask and had his headband tilted over one eye. It left just a single eye visible that was currently closed in a strange facsimile of a smile. The blonde quickly gathered his bearings and scrambled to his feet, an indignant look on his face. "What's it to you, Cyclops?" To his frustration, the man's amused exterior never changed or flickered for a moment, and he simply chuckled before looking down at the stacks of books surrounding the boy. "Well, I was heading to a training ground and spotted you here, seemingly in deep thought. While I admire your work ethic, kid, maybe your studies would be a bit more effective with a real sensei?" Naruto glared at the man suspiciously for a moment, thinking about what to say. "This isn't the way to the training grounds, Cyclops," he pointed out suspiciously. Far from being caught off guard, the man only chuckled again, shrugging before scratching his head almost helplessly. Oh, well, guess I got rode on the road of life. Oh, and my name is Kakashi by the way, not Cyclops. Naruto blinked at the response. The more time he spent next to this man, the more confused he got. Yeah, well, whatever, I'm not going back to that place. Kakashi just quirked a single eyebrow, not that Naruto could have seen otherwise, and looked off absently in the direction of the academy. Oh, is that so? How else do you expect to become a shinobi? The older man almost seemed like he wanted to chuckle again, considering Naruto was increasingly looking like a bird that had just been doused with water, feathers ruffled and everything. I'll do it myself. I don't need people who don't want me. Kakashi tilted his head a little, oddly reminding Naruto of a dog, before giving that strange smile again. Ah, and I see that is going well based on all these books you've read? His tone was thick with sarcasm as he motioned to the books strewn about, none of them opened past the 10th page. For the first time in the conversation, Naruto allowed something other than indignation on his face as his cheeks turned a pale red hue. It's not my fault if the books all use stupid long words. They should just say what they are trying to say, Ibeo. Kakashi suddenly surprised the younger boy by plopping to the ground, his head cocking to the other side again as he seemed to peer right through Naruto. Infuriatingly, even sitting down he was still at eye level with the diminutive 6-year-old. He continued to stare at Naruto, who grew increasingly weirded out, before finally giving out a thoughtful hum. No. Naruto blinked. The man had been silent for so long that when he finally spoke, Naruto had just been expecting more. No? The man nodded succinctly, smiling again as if he had come across some great revelation with this simple word. No, I don't think your problem is the books or the academy. After all, you seemed pretty quick to give up on both. Suddenly Naruto's face was red for a wholly different reason as he bristled, much to Kakashi's amusement again. Hey, I didn't give up, Datbeo. However, much to his chagrin, Kakashi simply waved away his angry words absently as if he were shooing some irritating puppy. Sure, but like I was saying, they aren't your problem. Naruto paused at that, suddenly feeling a little interested despite his previous irritation. Your problem is that you lack a goal, Kakashi summed up sagely. Naruto blinked, his anger gone as he slowly sunk to the ground, his shoulders slumping a little. A goal? Kakashi gave him an eye smile as he saw him become less aggressive, and a little more receptive to what he was saying. A goal, a driving force behind what you do. Motivation so that you don't just quit as soon as it becomes a little difficult. Kakashi motioned towards the books again and Naruto rightfully looked sheepish, before looking back up at the Junin questioningly. So what should my goal be? At that, Kakashi could only shrug, still with the odd expression of his. I can't really tell you that, kid, it has to be yours, otherwise it's pointless. Naruto frowned at that, internally pondering just what could be his goal. It started to make him think about why he did anything in a village that didn't seem to even want him, which just made him depressed like what always happened when he was alone with his thoughts. It was the reason he was so fond of distracting himself, so he wouldn't have to think about these painful things. But Naruto looked up as he saw Kakashi peering at him intently, smile gone and replaced with a more contemplative expression. A lot of powerful shinobi, like the Hokage for instance, make their goal to become strong enough to protect what is important to them, and Naruto was now rapt on every word Kakashi said. And Kakashi chuckled at the boy, suddenly reaching across to ruffle his hair, much to his annoyance. And, like the Hokage, you need to start at the bottom, in the academy, he concluded. Naruto groaned, pulling away from the man in his hand and clambering to his feet. Fine, I get it, Ibeo. I'll go back. Kakashi stood up as well, mock saluting the boy with 2 fingers as he turned to leave. Don't worry about it too much, kid, once you have that goal, I'm sure you'll be fine. With that, he suddenly flickered before vanishing completely, making Naruto's eyes widen with awe. He walked forward a few steps to where the Junin had been, only to look down as his foot landed on something that wasn't grass. At first glance he thought it was one of the library books, but it was too small. Picking up the nondescript black book and flicking it open to the first page, he realized it was filled with various profiles of different ninja, some of them clearly marked as Nuke Nin. Hey CYC, Kakashi-san? The blonde called out into the trees, but when no answer came he looked back down at the book in confusion, wondering how the man had managed to drop it. With a shrug he threw it atop the pile of books he already had, frowning as he realized he was going to have to return them before going back to the academy. True to his word, Naruto did go back to the academy that day, simply walking into class during the second period and sitting down. The teacher said nothing, continuing his class like nothing had happened, even while the other kids whispered amongst themselves about the troublemaker. Far from his usual loud self, Naruto was surprisingly withdrawn during the rest of the day, thinking about the little black book he now had in his sleeveless orange hoodie's front pocket. He had tried to return it at the library with the other books, as he had assumed that was just what you did with books, but the Chunin had told him he couldn't just give the library any old book he hadn't checked out. So now he was holding onto it, his fingers clicking across the table as he felt its weight in his pocket. Looking up he saw the teacher was writing maths equations up on the board, complicated things Naruto couldn't even begin working out. Instead his hand almost subconsciously slipped into his front pocket, fingers tracing across the smooth book cover. He took it out and opened it up discreetly, idly flicking through the first couple of pages. At first it was just out of idle curiosity. After all, it was basically filled with pages of powerful shinobi, along with a bit of information on them. The more he read though, the more he found himself engrossed. These shinobi and kunoichi were from all over the elemental nations. Their headbands, scratched out or not, were showing a plethora of different symbols, some they hadn't even been taught about. All their skill sets were so different it almost boggled the young boy's mind how they had all become so powerful through such different methods. Then of course it happened. Naruto flipped the page and there, at the top, marking the shinobi's rank and therefore ability, was a large, bold S. Naruto paused, looking at the page to see if he had gotten it wrong, but sure enough it was an S, the highest rank a shinobi could be given. Akasuna no Sasori. That would be the name engraved into Naruto's mind for the remainder of his life. At first glance Naruto could see a lot of similarities between himself and the young-looking red-headed teenager staring blankly out of the page at him, the spiky hair for one. As he read down he only grew more intrigued, completely uncaring that this man was also a nuke nin. Puppeteer. At that moment Naruto had no idea how much reading that one word would affect his life, but he knew he was interested. The whole concept seemed to appeal to him. Building puppets to use in fighting almost sounded like making your own friends, ones that would never be able to rebuke or disappoint him, because he controlled them completely. Slowly a grin spilt his features as he read on, the lesson continuing around him forgotten. It was almost disappointing when he reached the end of the profile. He immediately flicked through the book to find more puppeteers, but there were only a few B ranks, nothing as impressive as the supposed repertoire Sasori had at his command. It was disappointing, but it didn't get Naruto down. For once he had found something that honestly and truly interested him, something to aim for, to be good at, to become powerful with. A goal. The rest of the day passed far too slowly for Naruto's liking. As soon as the last bell rang he was out of the classroom so fast it was as though he had used the body flicker. It took him only a few minutes at that pace to reach the library, and he immediately rushed up to the desk where the bored Chunin still sat, leaning back on his chair and flicking through a small orange book. Much to Naruto's annoyance though, when he asked for a book on puppetry the man had looked at him with a raised eyebrow and a snort before walking off and coming back with a children's book for beginner puppets. Unfortunately not the type Naruto wanted. What's this, Ibeo? The Chunin didn't really seem interested in talking, instead returning to his little book, at least until Naruto threw the offending manual at the teen, nearly causing him to fall backwards off his chair. Oi, what the hell was that, Gaki? Naruto just returned the angry expression as he motioned to the brightly colored book now lying on the floor. That's not what I asked for, you jerk. The Chunin with the bandage across his nose simply picked up the book with an indignant sneer. It's about puppetry, ain't it? He tried to force the book back into Naruto's hands but the blonde simply looked at it as if it were vegetables in his ramen. Yeah, the stupid kind, Ibeo. Naruto didn't care about some silly civilian form of entertainment. His puppets would be awesome and scary, not for cheap laughs. The Chunin just looked confused as he scratched his head. What, you're talking about the ninja art those sandy sandals use? Why the hell would you be looking that up? Naruto just grinned, jabbing himself in the chest with a thumb. I'm going to be the best puppeteer ever, Ibeo. The Chunin stared at the kid for a good few moments before bursting out laughing, walking off into the bookshelves before returning a few moments later, still wiping at his eyes from his laughter as he plopped a book into Naruto's hands. "That's a good one, kid. A Konoha shinobi becoming a puppeteer. Sorry to burst your bubble, but that's a secret art, and damn if Suna don't guard their secrets like a merchant does his purse." Naruto looked down at the book. It seemed pretty old and seemed to contain accounts of puppeteering from a Konoha perspective during the Second Shinobi War. Naruto blinked at that. He hadn't even known there were shinobi wars, never mind two of them. Suddenly, he remembered the Chunin's laughter. "I don't care, I'll do it anyway." The older shinobi looked at him for a few more moments before shrugging and sitting back down. "Knock yourself out, kid. Hell, if you manage it, I'll be able to laugh at those Suna nen having one of their prized arts being figured out by a gaki." Ignoring the last comment due to his mixed feelings regarding the veiled encouragement, Naruto just nodded slowly before rushing out and back to his apartment. That evening he stayed up reading that old book until lights had begun going out outside his window. There was definitely nothing technical and not even a single insight for how the ninja craft could possibly work, but he had begun to gain a glimpse at how it might be done. First and foremost seemed to be these chakra strings Suna shinobi seemed to be able to make. Now he just had to figure out what the hell chakra was. A niggling feeling in the back of Naruto's mind told him that learning puppeteering might just take a while, and more than a few trips to the library. As Naruto sat on his favorite stool in Ichiraku Ramen, slurping at his noodles and listening to the bustle of the village behind him, he reflected on the past few months. Surprisingly, once he had set a goal in his mind, he found it a lot easier to think. Instead of his thoughts drifting to his past, he simply focused on what was now important to him. It was both liberating and enlightening. For instance, he was amazed at the ease it took to unlock his own chakra, managing it just a few days after first learning about puppeteering from helpful instructions he found in a book. Making it usable, on the other hand, was, and continued to be, a problem. Controlling the energy that now coursed through his body posed a challenge he had never imagined before. Considering they hadn't begun to teach it in the academy, despite many of the clan children already having it unlocked, he could get no help there. He was instead forced to rely on his new home away from home, the library. Even then, the explanations offered by the many books on the subject were both difficult to understand, and rather long. Naruto was a doer, not a reader. But all the same he persevered, always keeping that goal clear in his mind. He had gotten it to the point where he could expel his chakra from his fingers, definitely a step in the right direction in his eyes. Unfortunately, every advance was met with another roadblock. Creating strings out of his chakra proved to be damn near impossible. The problem was that chakra had no real substance. When it came out of his fingers, it was just a wispy, purple, steam-like substance. It was somewhere between a liquid and a gas, with the consistency of a cloud. How he was supposed to turn that into something tangible, that could actually latch onto a puppet, was far beyond him. Considering Konoha had never invested time into working out how puppeteering worked, even the library couldn't help him on that front. Maybe his control was simply lacking? While it was true he could somewhat push and pull the wispy chakra he emitted, it wasn't to any great degree. Maybe if he just worked harder at those chakra control exercises he had been reading about, he could manage a short thread and just make it longer over time. He sighed into his ramen, already feeling a small headache form as he thought of all the leaves he was going to disintegrate before he could get that damn exercise down. What's the long face for Naruto-kun? The blonde looked up, spotting Ayame staring at him from the kitchen in the back of the stand. Tucci must have stepped out for a while. She was kneading the dough that would eventually become the ramen noodles. Watching her or Tucci doing that as a kid had always calmed him. Just watching as they spanned the dough, stringing it out, spinning it more before pulling once again, on and on, until they could form it into the thin, thread-like. Naruto's eyes suddenly widened as he looked down at his hands incredulously, wondering just how stupid he had been to miss something so obvious. Suddenly, and to Ayame's great surprise, he vaulted the counter and threw his arms around the older girl, a beaming grin lighting up his face. "You're the best, Ayame-ne-chan." As quickly as the hug came, Naruto was gone, vaulting back over the counter and off in the direction of his apartment. The poor ramen waitress was left shell-shocked and confused, blinking once or twice before chuckling to herself, shaking her head at the young boy's antics. The moment Naruto got home, he leapt over his couch and grabbed the small wooden doll he had left there the previous night. It was a simple thing that he hadn't even made. The academy used it in their anatomy lessons and Naruto had simply taken it one day. He had thought having something to aim at would help him create the strings. Even if it hadn't, he still kept it around anyway. Now though, as he placed it in front of him, he couldn't keep the smile off his face. He quickly felt through his body for the surge of energy contained deep within and brought it to the surface, focusing it to his fingertips. Where before he simply allowed the wispy blue chakra to steam out of his fingers, this time he did his utmost to spin it, trying to coil the insubstantial mist into a thread. His eyes widened greatly as instead of the purplish mist he usually got, he found an almost conical stream exiting each of his fingers. He was so surprised that he immediately lost control, and the chakra quickly dissipated into the air. He didn't care at all. Yes, he jumped up in the air, pumping his fist up with his exclamation of excitement as he did a small dance of happiness around his table. It certainly wasn't a thread, but it was something, and Naruto could work with something. He could finally feel his dream coming together. Unfortunately, Naruto had no idea that, finally, would take more than 6 months. It took him that long, practicing every day after school, before he could form anything even vaguely reminiscent of chakra strains. It was slow going, both because forming them as he was inefficient and tiring, so he couldn't practice for long, and occasionally he would practice too hard and end up burning out the tenketsu of his fingertips. Those incidents cost him weeks of practice at a time before his chakra system could heal. That wasn't to say they were time wasted. Once he had gotten over the initial stigma, Naruto had actually found a lot to be enjoyed in reading, and not only about his favorite art or how to advance as a shinobi. Each book was like a portal to a different world, one where he didn't have to remember his past or focus on the ignorance the villagers gave him. Reading became his solace in a gray, ignorant world. He had even taken to doing it in class, not that his teachers cared. In the end he had finally managed to form the thrice-damned threads, only to realize he had no idea how he was supposed to attach them to a puppet. Another 3 months of refinement passed before he figured out the trick, purely by accident. He had gotten frustrated and tired after almost an hour of attempting it on the little wooden doll to the point where he began to lose control of the threads, making them fray at the ends. When he realized this and tried to fix them, they were still touching the doll, and with the next twitch of his finger the doll's arm had jerked forward. Naruto had fallen over his chair in surprise. Naruto walked slowly through the streets of the village. He had just left the academy, his last day of the first year in fact. Many of the other kids had rushed out ahead of him, happy to talk with their friends or make plans for the break before their second year. Naruto was content to simply stroll out. It was amazing how little he seemed to rush nowadays, now that he actually had somewhere to be. As he walked into an apartment that a year ago he wouldn't have recognized as his own, due to how clean it was, he could help but smile. There on his table, as it always was, stood the small wooden doll he practiced with. From the door he reached up, grinning as thin purple threads spanned themselves from his fingers and almost instantly gripped the puppet in strategic places. With a twitch of his thumb and ring finger it took a confident step forward, its head turning to look at him. With his index and middle fingers he forced the little figure to raise a hand and wave at him, a gesture to which he returned with a content smile. For a few minutes he made the doll run around, flipping and dancing about as his hands moved and his fingers flexed. He laughed as it performed a particularly flamboyant move of running up a wall, at least until the stunt caused a piece of paper he had tacked there to fall off and drift to the floor. He reached down to pick it up, only for his bright grin to suddenly sober as he realized what it was. A long time ago he had torn Sasori's profile from the bingo book and tacked it to his wall, as a reminder of his goal. Looking between the torn page and the wooden doll that, ironically, had its head tilted up almost expectantly, he frowned. He had no reason to be happy right now. It took all of his fingers to even control a puppet this small, and his chakra threads were so visible they actually glowed. Compared to the mastery Sasori had over his art, it was pitiful. The man was reputed to control 10 puppets at a time, a skill only his grandmother and the founder of the puppet art, Monzaemon Chikamatsu, had ever accomplished. Slowly Naruto's hand clenched into a fist. He still had so much to do if he wanted to reach his goal. This was just the beginning. It was sometime during his second year of official shinobi training that Naruto realized he truly despised the academy. Normally, the young blonde would be hesitant to say he really hated anything, disliked. Sure, there were plenty of things he disliked. To truly hate something, you had to have both strong feelings for, and have rationalized away any and all good points from, the offending subject. The academy had none. Not only was the institute filled to the brim with disappointments for the fledgling puppeteer, he honestly felt like he learned more from the library. The children within had initially shunned him, so he had lost all interest in vying for their attention or friendship, much preferring the company of the puppets he was constructing. The teachers likewise continued to ignore any questions he might have had. Not that he asked many, what with him supplementing his learning in the library. Lessons, he found, contained so many useless things, at least to his own mind, when it concerned becoming a shinobi, that it baffled him. Of course he accepted that, as a young child, he may not have the full picture. For instance, he had once asked one of the girls, out of sheer curiosity, what went on during their separate lessons. After the initial surprise at the troublemaker actually talking to her, the girl told him they learned how to arrange flowers in some. Naruto had nearly laughed out loud at that, and, when the girl had tried to defend, likely using her sensei's own words, by saying that it was for infiltration purposes, Naruto actually had. He had walked through the seedier parts of Konoha, seen the women there, and by now was fairly certain that seduction and infiltration had very little to do with the arrangement of a colorful bouquet. Taijutsu was so full of favoritism, it was as though the instructors had no wish for the various civilian children to even pass. They were often paired up against the clan children who had years of prior training. Even the weird timid girl with the pale eyes often soundly beat her opponents, although she was often annoyingly apologetic afterwards. Naruto was no different, often being paired up against the Uchiha boy, likely the best taijutsu user in the entire year, bar perhaps the Inuzuka boy. Naruto would always be swiftly and humiliatingly defeated in that regard, but then, that may have been because he rarely, if ever, practiced his taijutsu. That day, during the second year, when he had firmly come to believe that he despised the academy, was also the day he decided he had enough of being beaten around the sparring ring. Let's see, how about Uzumaki Naruto Aaa and Uchiha Sasuke, Anazawa-sensei, the second-year academy instructor, called out to the awaiting crowd of students just outside the sparring ring. Almost immediately, the young Uchiha strode out into the ring. It was a simple affair of a long rope marking out a roughly circular boundary. A few moments later, and Naruto, who had been hanging towards the back of the crowd, also walked in, a little more slowly. Anazawa raised an eyebrow at the way the young blonde was walking, as it seemed awfully stiff, but passed it off quickly enough. He had only called out the pair because it was always amusing to watch the blonde get beaten around the ring, never giving up, even when faced with an obviously superior opponent. Make the seal of confrontation. Sasuke did so with a bored expression while Naruto held up his hand, his face oddly passive as he slowly moved his fingers into the right pattern. Seeing that they had done so, Anazawa stepped out of the ring, hand held up before he brought it back down. Hajime. Instantly, the muttering and quiet chatter in the group of students ceased as they realized that, unlike usual, Naruto had not sprung forward to charge recklessly at Sasuke. Instead, the boys slowly moved into what appeared to be the academy style, something nobody had seen Naruto use before. Deciding to just get this over with, Sasuke moved forward, his speed impressive for his age as he darted towards the blonde. He figured he would try and go for the one-hit knockout, sending a straight punch for the boy's face while actually aiming for his stomach. His eyes widened incredulously when Naruto's knee suddenly appeared between them, blocking his attack while the blonde himself leaned back, letting the feint pass overhead. He continued to surprise everyone by bringing his other leg up with more speed than he had ever shown before, cracking Sasuke right in the chin and sending the boy flying back, but not out of the ring. The boy got up slowly, his eyes wide as he rubbed his chin. That kick had felt like being slammed by a door. Steel entered the young Uchiha's eyes as he settled down into his own style that his father was teaching him, the smallest of smiles beginning to tug at his lips. When the two met again, Sasuke was no longer underestimating the blonde and the exchange was far more even. Sasuke was obviously the faster and more flexible of the two, but Naruto hit like a steel bar and he didn't even seem to feel the blows that got through his guard, his expression never changing once. The most concerning thing was that Naruto seemed to be able to predict all of his moves, as if he had eyes in the back of his head. Eventually Sasuke was left panting, nursing more than a few nasty bruises, while Naruto still stood in that infuriatingly calm, stiff stance. Anazawa, just like the students, had been watching in amazement and disbelief as the supposed dead last had actually beaten the current top student in what was supposed to be Sasuke's forte. However, just as he was about to call the match to preserve a bit of Sasuke's pride, he noticed something that made his eyes narrow. Wait a second, he suddenly stepped into the ring, grabbing Naruto by the scruff off his neck and picking him up off his feet, all while the boy's expression never changed, like a permanent mask. He forced chakra into the boy, breaking the henge he had noticed over him. There was a poof of smoke and suddenly, in place of the blonde, there was a rough-hewn wooden mannequin. It looked like it had been slapped together from tree logs. Whatever Anazawa had been expecting, it certainly wasn't that. What was more surprising were the thin, almost invisible blue threads emerging from the puppet that retreated into the crowd of students. Naruto, get out here. A few seconds later and the blonde walked out from his classmates, wearing a hooded gray jacket that was closed at the front. The sleeves were far too long for his arms, easily covering his hands and therefore the movement of his fingers. He pulled the hood back to reveal his smirking features. Beneath the sleeves his fingers twitched and the puppet in Anazawa's hands jerked to life, quickly hopping out of his grasp and clacking over to stand beside its creator. What do you think, sensei? Pretty cool, huh? Naruto said with a genuine smile. I call him Dammy. He's a little rough around the edges, but for my first life-size puppet I'm pretty proud of him. For a long few moments there was silence as the entire class gaped at Naruto and the rough dummy standing by his sides. Naruto, did you make this thing? The instructor asked slowly. The blonde nodded happily, still smirking at the shocked looks on his classmates' faces. And what you did back there? That was puppetry, like a Sunanin. Another nod caused the older Chunin to flounder his words for a moment, torn between being impressed that an academy student, barely 8 years old, had somehow managed to reverse engineer one of Sanagakure's most prized techniques, and irritated that it was this particular student. Finally though, his features schooled as an uncharacteristic scowl found its way onto his features. You're disqualified for cheating. Naruto blinked, the smirk slipping of his face as he nearly lost control of Dammy, causing one of its arms to fall limply. Wait, what? The Chunin huffed at the boy, poking the puppet in the chest rather roughly. You cheated, using jutsu in a taijutsu spar. Don't do it again or you'll have detention. Naruto gaped at the man, unsure of what to say to something like that. Unfortunately, his classmates seemed to have been broken out of their stupor by the harsh admonishment. Yeah, don't be such a sore loser that you have to cheat, Dobi. That remark was courtesy of Inuzuka Kiba, a rowdy brown-haired boy who quickly instigated the rest of the class into jeering. Cheater. Yeah, there's no way Sasuke would lose to you without you cheating. Go play with your dolls somewhere else, Dobi. The rest were along the same lines, and Naruto's confused expression slowly morphed into a deep scowl. Pulling the hood back up over his head and commanding Dammy to follow him, he made a move to walk back into the crowd only to be stopped by his sensei's voice again. Naruto, I'll be taking you to see the Hokage after the academy day is over. He'll want to hear about your extracurricular activities. Naruto froze but didn't turn around, slowly nodded before retreating to the back of the crowd, his classmates' jeers and shouts still ringing in his ears. Oh yes, he despised the academy all right. In Naruto's humble opinion, the look of utter shock on the Hokage's face that day as he demonstrated his puppeteering was damn near worth the jeers of his classmates. He was sure the pipe that was almost a permanent feature on the old man's face nearly fell out as he made Dammy wave causally at the aged Kage in greeting. That was the high point though, and the meeting had only gone downhill from there. The Hokage had immediately asked him who had been training him in puppeteering. It was a hard-to-describe feeling when one of the people you looked up to the most showed just how little they thought of you. Even worse, when Naruto had defended himself and told the Hokage he had learned everything himself through mostly trial and error, the man had asked for proof. Proof? The proof was in the bandages running up Naruto's arms from the times he had burned out the tenketsu in his hands. The proof was in the sweat he had poured into creating Dammy and the excruciatingly long hours he had spent in his apartment, long into the night, learning how to control him to the extent he could successfully imitate himself. It had taken far too long to convince the man that this was his own endeavor, and by the end Naruto felt an almost physical pain in his chest every time he would see the aged Kage's eyes looking him over skeptically. The final insult came as Naruto was leaving, disheartened and disillusioned, when the Hokage had the gall, the utter nerve, to tell him he was proud of Naruto. Proud. The man had spent the past half hour trying to convince Naruto to tell him who his mysterious trainer was, and when he finally accepted there was no such person, suddenly he was proud. As Naruto left that office he made a silent vow to himself behind a cold mask that hid a furious scowl. He'd show them proud. Amino Iruka was not normally the type of man to let his class see his good moods easily. However, as he walked into the classroom that day, he didn't bother to hide his warm smile. After all, today was the graduation exam for his latest group of students, and what a group it was. The young Chunin felt rather privileged to have borne witness to what he truly believed to be the future of Konoha. Never had a class been so full of both future clan heads and promising shinobi, and Iruka was the one to finally see them off on their long journey to becoming the fine ninja he could already see in them. As he let his gaze drift about the room he felt pride seeing each and every hopeful face. Maybe not all of them would receive their headband today, but those that had worked hard and truly deserved it would, and that was what mattered. He caught a glimpse of the Uchiha boy, a real tragic story over what happened to the poor kid's clan. Yet, that didn't stop him from becoming Rookie of the Year. In the middle rows he saw Ino, Hinata, Choji, Shikamaru and Shino either talking to one another or patiently waiting for class to start. All of them would become the future backbone of the village as prominent members of their clans. Even Kiba looked joyous, and while he had an older sibling that would likely take their mother's place, he was sure the young Inuzuka would go on to do great things for the village. Then Iruka's eyes drifted over him, the boy sitting pretty much as far from the teacher's desk as he was physically able without just up and leaving the room. Uzumaki Naruto was an enigma to the scarred Chunin, and had been ever since he had taken over their class 2 years ago. He had been told the boy was a boisterous, loud-mouthed brat to begin with, but sometime during his second year he had simply stopped, fading away into the background. Around the same time the instructors had seen an almost meteoric rise in the blonde's grades. So much so, that he had begun to threaten some of the top students' positions like Sasuke and Sakura, academically at least. On the physical side of things he suffered greatly, not that the cause of it was unknown. Ever since that day when the boy's alternate hobby was first revealed, he had made a challenge out of trying to sneak his hanged puppets into the rain, only getting better at it thanks to the teacher's continued vigilance. To this day Iruka could rarely tell the difference between the puppeteer and the puppet, which he supposed was the point. It was often said through gritted teeth, but nobody could disagree that what the boy showed in his ability with a purely reverse-engineered technique was undoubtedly prodigious skill. One day though, it just stopped. Naruto's grades took a massive dive almost overnight. However, not for the reasons many thought, or even hoped for. No, it was blatantly obvious Naruto was purposefully lowering his grades, almost as if he was taunting the academy. He consistently kept his grades at the point where he was riding the curve, always just within graduating boundaries, effectively making him the dead last once more. It didn't take a genius to see he was purposefully rubbing out correct answers. One day Iruka had decided to just mark the faded answers anyway, as they were still technically correct. The next day when Naruto handed his work in the answers were rubbed out even harder, until the blonde had almost ripped the paper. The boy always wore a hood nowadays that shadowed his features, but Iruka definitely saw a smirk on his lips that day. Nobody had any idea why he had suddenly decided he wanted to be the dead last, but then, nobody could figure out Uzumaki Naruto at all. The boy would sometimes miss 2 or 3 days of school entirely, coming in on the third day looking worn out, ill, or covered with various injuries. Honestly, Iruka swore that sometimes it looked like the boy had just gone out and poisoned himself. His arms were consistently covered with bandages, and one time when they had slipped off during a taijutsu spar he had actually participated in, they revealed reddened, burned flesh along with many inflamed dots the Chunin could only assume were the boy's tenketsu. Over the years the dark shadows under Naruto's eyes, that were clearly a sign of prolonged sleep deprivation, only grew worse and Iruka was fairly certain they were now a permanent feature on his face. Likewise, the previously tanned complexion he had bore as a younger child was gone. The kid had paled considerably, leading Haruka to believe he was staying up long into the nights, rarely venturing from his apartment. Even those were difficult to spot now, as the boy had also taken to wearing tinted orange goggles that were almost visor-like. They covered the majority of his upper face when worn. If they weren't on his face, then they hung around his neck, showing half-lidded, bored-looking eyes that gazed out at the world as if through a pane of glass, detached and uncaring. The young instructor eventually tore his gaze from Naruto, trying to shake his head of the thoughts that always appeared as he looked at the boy. Instead, he coughed into his hand, trying to get the class to quiet down. As per usual, that did nothing. Why did he ever believe it would work, when it hadn't for the past 2 years? Quiet down. The entire class went silent as the so-called big head jutsu was brought into play, something that made Haruka rather infamous among the students. Once they were silent, Haruka smiled proudly up at them as if nothing had happened. Now, we all know just what we're here for today, so let's get going as soon as possible, starting with the written portion of the exam. As Haruka moved behind his desk to grab the test papers he had locked up in the drawer, a single bead of cold sweat ran down the back of his neck. He swore at that moment he could actually feel Naruto's gaze on his back as well as the hidden smirk on the boy's features. As Naruto took his newly earned headband off of Mizuki, not even bothering to hide his smirk, he made sure to make a small show of deciding how to wear it. Eventually he simply stuffed it into one of the many pockets he had strewn about his person. Once he had been likened to having a small pocket dimension on his person from all the random things he would keep stored, almost impossibly so in some cases. Mostly it was thanks to the large, hooded jacket he wore. It was open at the front to show the simple vest he wore atop a standard mesh shirt. There were also a fair few pockets in the long, baggy trousers he wore, taped up at the shins, but nothing too important was kept there. He walked home relatively slowly that day, for once enjoying the sun even if none really touched his skin. The graduation exams had ended not too long after lunch, so the hubbub in the village had died down for the meantime, at least until the sun started to descend down the horizon again. Naruto was back at his apartment before then, so he had a blissfully lonely walk through the relatively quiet streets, just thinking of how everything had worked out. That was the main reason for his smile, not passing. He knew he would pass from the moment he stole the written test's answer key from Haruka's desk, days in advance. They still had team placements tomorrow, but Naruto wasn't too worried. He knew he would graduate as dead last, so his spot on a good team was practically guaranteed. It was ironic that the Chunin instructors still had no idea why his grades had suddenly taken a dive one day. It was simple, really. Naruto had simply found out the standard team arrangements for the Rookie of the Year, Kunoichi of the Year and the Dead Last. It was rather obvious that Sasuke would become Rookie of the Year. Even if Naruto had pushed himself to the max, he would never have caught up to the Uchiha. He had both a late start grades-wise and his taijutsu was woefully subpar. Even with the dip the dark-haired boy had taken when his clan was slaughtered, the Uchiha had achieved consistently excellent grades in nearly everything. The obvious answer then was to become the dead last. Being on the same team as Sasuke wasn't ideal, but the blonde had a feeling that last Uchiha would be getting a good instructor. Naruto simply wanted his share. When it had actually begun to work, Naruto was honestly quite surprised. After all, he was supposed to just be an academy student. Outsmarting Chunin, and it certainly felt like that was what he was doing, wasn't supposed to be an option. Naruto wasn't book smart in the traditional sense. He was good at reading now, but it still took him time to absorb various concepts purely from a page. In practice, luckily, it was a different story. Give him enough time to simply try something out, and the boy felt like there was nothing he couldn't work out. His thoughts turned away from introspection though as he arrived back home, the old rustic apartment building he shared with 1 or 2 others, all on different floors. It was a painfully plain building, perfectly blending into the surrounding aesthetic with its 6-story structure and simple tiled roof. Still, it was home. He expertly skirted around the old dog that always lay outside the first-floor occupant's door before simply walking right up the stairwell's far wall. It really was amazing what one could find in the library when they started looking where they shouldn't. Fumbling through his pockets for only a moment, he really might have too many, he quickly opened his door, only to blanch at what he saw inside. In his small kitchenette, a large vaporous cloud of noxious-looking purple mist was slowly expanding out from where a small cup of equally vicious-looking liquid had spilled over onto the hob. In a panic, he grabbed a nearby cloth, quickly dashed to his bathroom to wet it, slapped his goggles over his eyes and the damp cloth to his mouth, before rushing through the vapor to open the window. Fortunately, the dense cloud immediately flowed outside. Unfortunately, it was right into the path of a small blue bird sitting on a cable outside. The poor creature couldn't even flap its wings before its tiny heart completely gave out from a massive overdose of poison that really wasn't supposed to be inhaled. Before it could fall off the wire though, a few invisible strands of chakra latched onto its body, yanking it into the apartment. Making sure the cloud had fully dissipated outside, Naruto sighed, righting the spilt bottle and closing the window again. For a moment, he looked down at the little bird in his hands with a detached expression. It wasn't like he was unused to seeing dead animal. He had to test his poisons on something. Then again, that something was more often than not himself. There was a reason he often missed whole days of the academy to recover. On a brighter note, he had observed there was a lot more motivation to come up with antidotes when he had the poison coursing through his bloodstream. Plus, he had to have been developing some sort of immunity or resistance by now, right? With a thoughtful look, he held the bird out in front of him with his chakra threads, moving them about to find the most strategic places that could manipulate it with the least amount of effort. He quickly eliminated 6 fingers, leaving one on the back of its neck, one for each wing joint and another split between its little clawed feet. Suddenly the bird shuddered into some facsimile of life, fluttering its wings experimentally before hopping onto a nearby workbench. Its head cocked so that its glassy, unseeing eyes looked over at Naruto. He only looked back with interest as he forced the bird to extend, then retract, then extend its wings again. A gleam entered the blonde's eye as he rushed over to his main workbench where most of his puppets were constructed. He quickly but carefully moved Dami out of the way. He wasn't even sure why he kept the old puppet, probably just sentimentality. Naruto shrugged internally as he set the bird down before grabbing his tools from their nearby hook, a bright grin on his face as ideas swam through his head, just waiting for him to pick out the ones that would connect together like one big jigsaw. It was probably going to be another sleepless night for him. Kakashi felt like putting his face in his hands as he looked over his new genin team. Well, he would see about that soon enough. First, there was Sasuke, who was pretty much how he had expected the boy. Not exactly a good thing, but it was workable. The kid simply needed some attachments to his village and to seriously tone down his obsession with his brother, at least if his introduction was anything to go on. When he had walked in on the team 3 hours late to the team placements, the Uchiha had been over by the wall, glaring out of the window, not saying a word as he entered late, even if the irritation was obvious. Sakura was unique. If Kakashi was expecting something different from the top kunoichi, he regretted it now. The girl certainly had a one-track mind if nothing else. Oh yes, her one-of-a-kind introduction said that much about her. She had been the one to scream at him for being late in a rather shrill voice. He sincerely hoped that was just a phase. Still, the grades couldn't be that misleading. He was sure once he got her out in the field and got a feel for her skills, he would see what the academy instructors saw in her. Then there was Naruto. When he had walked into the classroom, the boy had been sound asleep at his desk, his body covered up almost as much as an aburame. Even now his head kept occasionally nodding forward, and his already lidded eyes looked ready to close. The shadows under his eyes were far too deep to be healthy, and yet this boy was supposed to be some sort of one-of-a-kind prodigy. Forgive Kakashi if he couldn't quite see it. He wasn't entirely sure why he was considered a prodigy. The man had sort of skimmed over the academy reports. Hell, if the kid's introduction was anything on what he'd be dealing with over the coming months, Kakashi couldn't wait for his team to fail like all the others. Yondaimi's legacy and last Uchiha be damned. Alright then. Kakashi was sure there was a large drop of sweat rolling down the back of his neck as he forced his eyebrow not to vanish into his hairline at Sakura's introduction. Sure, he'd call it that for now. How about you, Blondie? He turned, only for the sweat drop to grow exponentially larger. Naruto had at some point in their statements simply fallen asleep, his face resting against his chest as he miraculously stayed sitting up. Hey, Naruto, don't fall asleep. You're as bad as Shikamaru. Sakura made to swing at the back of the blonde's head to wake him. You only for Naruto to suddenly slump back at that exact moment. Sakura's swing went wide and she lost balance, awkwardly collapsing over Naruto's unconscious form, the impact on his chest jolting the young puppeteer awake. He blinked once, half-lidded eyes looking down at the weight pressing against his chest. "Sakura, get off me." The pinkette immediately scrambled up of the boy, scooting more than was necessary along the bench away from him, her face a virulent red and her eye twitching uncontrollably. More sedately, Naruto also got up, looking tiredly around at the silver-haired Junin and sullen Uchiha who were staring back at him with varied expressions. Sakura avoided his gaze as she tried to keep her face from matching her hair color. "What did I miss?" There was that sweat drop getting bigger again as Kakashi forced an eye smile to his face. "We were introducing ourselves, it's your turn." Naruto blinked wearily, looking as though he would much rather be asleep, but then, he didn't want to make a bad impression on his sensei. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto." There was a long awkward pause as the blonde began to feel unnerved by the stares he was receiving. He had no clue that to his classmates he was just as much of an enigma as he was to his instructors. He used to be that troublemaking kid, but then one day he had just faded away, only really being noticed in his absence. Even Sasuke was mildly intrigued by the only other introverted kid in their class. Somewhere else in the village a shades-wearing boy with spiky brown and a high-collared gray jacket sneezed very quietly before consulting with the hive of insects within him as to the cause of his sudden irritation. And Naruto just raised an eyebrow at the silver-haired man. "And, what?" The Junin raised his hand, ready to continue, but decided against it, letting it drop to his side lamely. "Never mind, that'll do." At this point Sakura had recovered and both she and Sasuke were staring at Naruto and Kakashi strangely. And so now they were here and Kakashi was left with one irritable avenger, a blushing fangirl, and a sleepy prodigy, just great. Well, now that we all know a bit more about one another. Sasuke and Sakura sweat dropped at that, having only learned the name of their sensei and absolutely nothing new about their teammate. "I'll get right to the point. You guys aren't genin just yet. There's one last test before you can say that." At that, even Naruto seemed a little more alert as the three genin looked at their sensei cautiously. Glad to have their attention, Kakashi continued. "That test you did was to see if you possessed the required skills to become genin. Now I get to see how you put them to use. Come to Training Ground 3 tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp." With that the man stood up, giving a flippant wave and a final parting comment. "Oh, I recommend you don't eat anything, you'll just be sick." Not that it really did any good for Naruto, as the boy had already fallen backwards off the bench and was sound asleep again. Kakashi scratched the back of his head as he looked over the dozing blonde. "Oh, and someone tell Naruto, okay?" Without another word his body flickered for a moment before vanishing entirely. Despite what he said, neither of Naruto's teammates made any effort to wake the puppeteer up. Sasuke simply walked out and Sakura was hot on his heels, trying to think of a way to ask the stoic boy out for a meal. A few moments later, when he was certain he was alone, Naruto's eye cracked open and a grin alighted on his lips. Now the real fun began. Or, maybe in another 5 minutes. He really was quite tired. Wataru was a fairly plain man by his own standards, a bartender by trade due to a leg injury forcing him to resign his post as a chunin. He had done nothing especially exciting in his life, having been too young to have had any meaningful part in the Third Shinobi War, and never going on any unique or life-changing missions. However, that didn't mean he wasn't content with his life. He was able to ease the problems of weary ninja, listen to their stories and sometimes even pick up a bit of interesting information. That was why, when another brown-haired, dull-eyed chunin that he didn't recognize walked into his bar and took a seat on one of the counter's empty stools, he gave the man a friendly wave and a saucer of sake. "You look tired, kid. Rough mission?" The chunin accepted the drink, picking it up and staring at it for a moment before tipping it down his throat in one go. Immediately, the poor teen's eyes went wide as he began coughing into his hand, making Wataru smile and pat the kid on the back. "Whoa there kid, take it slow. It's like you've never had a sip of sake before." The brown-haired teen smiled back weakly, wheezing a little as the burning in his throat subsided. "Yeah, that helped a little." Wataru grinned and took to collecting a few of the empty bottles scattered over the counter. "I bet it did. Why don't you talk about it?" The Chunin looked down at the now empty saucer before shrugging half-heartedly. Sure, why not? You know that Kakashi guy? The bartender gave a quick nod. He had heard enough stories both from and about the man to have a clear enough picture of what he was like. I just came off a mission with him. Wataru gave a quick barking laugh as he began to wipe down the counter. It was getting late and soon a lot of the older Chunin and Junin would be stopping in for the late-night rush. I bet that was rough. I heard the man can be a slave driver on missions, yet at the same time manages to be as lazy as those dogs he summons. The young Chunin gave a small chuckle as he put a bit of money down on the bar. Wataru responded by sliding him a full bottle of sake. Yeah, I guess that summed it up pretty well. It was a pretty routine mission, but just having a Junin there really cranked it up notch. Wataru nodded again, making long motions with the cloth over the counter until it gleamed back at him. I bet it did. Those guys can be pretty intense. The Chunin took another sip, a smaller one this time, and only shuddered a little at the burn. Tell me about it, he muttered. Then again, those habits of his sure are something. Wataru smiled down at the counter, seeing his face reflected back at him from the freshly polished gleam before turning a grin on his lone customer. Ah, I guess you mean him being late all the time. Man, if I haven't heard more shinobi grumbling about his tardiness than I have complaints about that guy fellow. You know, one time, I heard he was almost 4 hours late, to a Junin meeting of all things. The Chunin laughed, looking a little rosy around the cheeks as he took another sip from his saucer. No kidding? He was about an hour late just to turn up to the mission. Both men shared a chuckle at that before Wataru leaned over the bar a little. You know, I gotta ask. I hear all these crazy rumors about the guy having a Sharingan under that headband of his. The Chunin's eyes widened ever so slightly. What do you know about that? The teen blinked before smiling sheepishly, taking another quick sip of the sake. Sorry I couldn't tell you. He had that thing down for the whole mission. All my squad mates were wondering what he had under there. Wataru sighed as he leaned back, slightly disappointed. Ah well, I guess I'll find out eventually. Bag, a mystery's that Kakashi fellow. The Chunin just nodded before inclining his head and pushing back off the stool. Well anyway, thanks for the drink. He walked out quickly, leaving Wataru to continue wiping down the bar. Anytime kid, oh I never did catch your. The Chunin was already gone. A few moments later another patron that had been sitting in a corner booth put down some money and wandered out. Wataru thought that was a weird one, wearing his hood up all the time and only ordering a glass of water. Then again, he used to be a Chunin so he knew ninja were all sorts of crazy. Outside, the hooded figure walked down a few streets, subtly tailing the mousy-haired teen before watching the same brown-haired Chunin walk down a nearby alleyway. He quickly hurried after him only to find the brown-haired teen waiting there for him. There was a moment of silence before the figure pulled down their hood, revealing a head of spiky blonde hair. Naruto had let his hair grow out a lot since he had started in the academy. The result was longer, thinner spikes that might have given him an almost Bishonen appearance when combined with his lithe frame and almost constantly narrowed eyes. You continue to amaze me with your acting skills, Dammy. A chakra thread attached to his hand twitched and suddenly the Chunin burst into smoke, revealing nothing more than a man-sized puppet. Naruto had long ago refined Dammy into what stood before him today. Shaving him back, smoothing out his body, articulating more joints and adding many compartments for general storage. The puppet lacked any defining features like a face, and had lost many of its combat capabilities with the change, but Naruto used him more for information gathering. Or perhaps, it is people's stupidity that amazes me. Naruto shrugged, unfurling a scroll from one of his many pockets before using it to quickly seal his puppet away. Taking out a notebook, he quickly jotted down what he had learned that night from the few other places he had visited. It was a good thing he had decided to use puppets instead of going himself, or he would have been quite drunk at this point. Cross-referencing what he had learned with the information he already had, he grinned in satisfaction. Seems the introduction was unnecessary, sensei. I think I know everything I need to. Absently, he swung a small bell out of his pocket and listened to it tinkle gently. More importantly, I know the trick behind this test of yours. There was no way he was being sent back to the academy. The next day when the 3 genin arrived at their predetermined time, only 2 of them were hungry from missing breakfast. All 3 looked tired from the early hour, But then, Naruto always looked tired, so he didn't really count. Sakura and Sasuke were slightly surprised when Naruto casually walked up to the meeting point on a small red bridge carrying a small stack of books. When he sat down on one of the bridge's wooden railings and began reading through the first at a surprising pace, it took Sakura almost 2 minutes before she finally commented. "Naruto, what are you doing?" The blonde didn't even look up from his book, an interesting if not rather stylized account of the Sannin's battle against Hanzo of the Salamander. "Passing the time until sensei arrives. I hate not making the most of my time." Sakura raised her eyebrow at the blonde and looked down at the small stack of books. It would take her a good few hours to get through them back to back. Sasuke looked over from where he was leaning against the railing, mildly interested at hearing the blonde say more than he had in the past few months. "How long do you expect to wait?" Naruto simply smirked beneath his hood, letting out a small breath of a laugh but didn't give an answer, making Sasuke's eye twitch in annoyance. Before he could comment, both his and Sakura's stomachs let out simultaneous growls, causing him to grumble and her to go bright pink from embarrassment. "You two should go get something to eat while you can." Both of his teammates looked at the young puppeteer oddly, but it was Sakura who spoke. "But sensei told us not to." Again, Naruto never looked up from his book. In fact, at that moment he quite calmly licked his thumb and used it to turn the page. "Sensei advised us not to eat, there is a difference. Unless you think you'll be sick from a mere test." Seeing Sasuke rise to the bait, Naruto hid his smirk as the Uchiha pushed off the railing. "Unless you have food in those bottomless pockets of yours, I don't think we'll have time to just walk off and get breakfast." Naruto shrugged noncommittally, flipping the page again. Sakura was actually a bit surprised by the rate he was reading. He often read books in class, which for some reason the instructors ignored, but never at this pace. It seemed he was at least keeping an ear on the lessons. "You might be surprised, but I figured you'd say as much." Still reading, he quickly withdrew 2 wrapped sandwiches from his jacket and threw them at his teammates. Sakura fumbled with hers a moment before looking at it, her stomach rumbling its own 2 cents. "But sensei said," she was surprised as Naruto suddenly cut her off by raising his hands, flapping them like a mouth. "But sensei said." Both she and Sasuke blinked at the perfect impersonation of Sakura's voice, down to the slight whine and pitch. Sasuke's eyes narrowed at that, wondering at this new piece of information about the blonde enigma. "I didn't know you could impersonate people's voices." He waited for Naruto's reply, only to turn as a voice suddenly sounded from behind him. "Oh, I don't know, Sasuke-kun. There might be a lot you don't know about Naruto." Sasuke swiveled at the sound of Kakashi's voice, only to see thin air behind him. It made him frown and look about for a bit before seeing Naruto smirk. "What are you looking for, Sasuke-kun?" This time Kakashi's voice came from Naruto and Sasuke knew he had been fooled. "So, you can throw your voice." Naruto shrugged. "Stop pestering Naruto-kun, Sasuke baka." Sasuke blanched as he turned to Sakura, only to see the girl looking at Naruto in surprise, her face bright red. "Stop impersonating me, Naruto baka." Naruto snickered into his book. It was surprisingly fun messing with his teammates. Eventually though, they all settled down a bit. Sakura and Sasuke ate their sandwiches while Naruto read, and over the next 2 hours they amused themselves as best they could. Occasionally, Naruto would mess with them a bit with his ventriloquism, all the while reading book after book until he was almost finished his last one. "Why hello my cute little graduates." Kakashi was a little surprised when he appeared on the bridge and greeted the teens, only for none of them to react. Sakura was lazily leaning over the railing and watching the fish swim down the river. "We're not falling for it again, Naruto baka," she muttered tiredly, looked up to berate him only for her eyes to go wide as saucers as she spotted their sensei, for real this time. "Oh, sensei." Suddenly she remembered how long she had been waiting. "You're late." Over on the other side of the bridge, Naruto snapped his book closed with mild irritation. He had only a few more pages. Couldn't Kakashi have been a little later? "Morning, sensei." Kakashi raised an eyebrow at the nonchalant greeting but didn't read too much into it. When he looked at Sasuke, the boy just grunted and pushed off the railing. "Yes, well, I think it's time to get started on your test." With that he pulled out 2 bells from a pouch on his hip, slightly suspicious of the sudden smirk gracing Naruto's features. "So, you all understand?" Seeing the 3 quick nods from his genin, Kakashi smiled, quickly tying the two bells to his waist where they jingled quietly. Good, then you have until midday. He produced a small stop clock and set it on a nearby tree stump. Great, then let's begin. Instantly Sakura and Sasuke vanished into the bushes, leaving Naruto and Kakashi alone in the middle of the training ground. The older Junin quirked his head at the blonde with a bemused gleam in his eye. You know, you aren't exactly winning any points for stealth. His eye was momentarily drawn to where he thought he saw a tiny streak of blue light but ignored it for the moment as Naruto spoke. I don't need to hide, I already have a bell. Kakashi's eye widened as he looked down at his side only to narrow it in confusion. Both bells were still there. When he turned, he saw Naruto holding up an identical bell he had produced from his jacket, causing the silver-haired man's brow to quirk. Are you in the habit of carrying around bells with you everywhere you go? It's not very stealthy for a ninja. Naruto shrugged and Kakashi quickly saw that conversation wouldn't be going anywhere. Well, that isn't the point of the exercise, I'm afraid. No matter how unorthodox a solution it might be. You have to get one of the two bells at my side. Naruto frowned as he casually threw the bell onto the ground with a small sigh. I figured it wouldn't be so easy. Just as Kakashi was about to move in and engage the boy in a bit of taijutsu, for motivation of course, his body went up in a cloud of smoke that was telltale of the substitution to Kakashi's trained eye. It was fairly inefficient, given the large cloud of white smoke it produced. Soon enough, it was apparent that it was deliberate, as when the smoke cleared, all Kakashi saw was a hole in the ground, roughly as wide as a man, and the tip of something long and slender disappearing within. Seeing that put the masked Junin on guard. It made him think that perhaps he should have given the academy reports a bit more attention. For a few minutes that felt much longer than they were, Kakashi stayed in that same position, slightly confused by his student's lack of aggressive action. All the while he kept an eye on the ground, wary for whatever had burrowed underneath the soil after that substitution, perhaps a summon. No, Kakashi quickly shook his head of that. It was absurd to think that a fresh genin not only had a summoning contract, but could actually produce something larger than a small dog. For a moment, he was tempted to lift his headband. It would be easy enough to see what was hiding beneath him then. He couldn't. That would be acknowledging an academy student to be at the level even some Junin hadn't pushed him to. His lone eye widened slightly as he noticed his own shadow becoming just slightly larger, looking up in time to catch the glint of a kunai, just shrouded by the light of the midday sun. He caught the extended arm easily enough and brought his knee up to counter the follow-up kick, throwing his attacker over his shoulder only to be surprised to see Sasuke crouched in a three-point stance. You shouldn't be so focused on me, sensei. Kakashi's ears twitched, forcing him to turn and see a small hail of glinting shuriken barreling towards him. He caught one with ease and used it to bat away the others, only to wince as the muscles in his hand suddenly locked up. In his haste and complacency, he had missed the slight purplish hue of poison lacing the shuriken. At least they had the intent to kill down. He turned as Sasuke went on the offensive again, using the slight advantage of Kakashi's temporarily paralyzed hand to almost scrape the bells in a brief exchange of fists. Shanuru. What he definitely wasn't expecting was, as he was locked in a brief bout with Sasuke, for Sakura to suddenly appear from the trees behind him, peppering the two combatants with as accurate kunai throws as she was able. It was painfully obvious that she had only ever practiced against stationary targets, as all it took was maneuvering Sasuke between him and the pinkette to get the Uchiha to break off the attack or risk being perforated. It was almost a shame, the two displayed such a good attempt at teamwork, now if only Naruto would. As the dark-haired boy jumped back, Kakashi only caught his smirk at the last moment before his lone eye widened at the small detail he was forgetting. Something burst right from the earth behind him, and as Kakashi turned to what he expected would be Naruto, his shock only grew. What had appeared could certainly not be considered human, even if its top half was undeniably female. More alarmingly though, the thing just seemed to open up all of a sudden, releasing veritable hail of kunai in a wide arc, mostly focused on Kakashi. In his shock at the thing's sudden appearance and, well, its appearance, Kakashi could only do his best to weave between the obviously poisoned weapons. To his shock, he heard the telltale sound of steel slicing through a cord. Sure enough, from the corner of his eye, he spotted the two shiny bells flying away from him. As he tried to reach for them, something long and thick whipped out at him, forcing him to bring up a guard. As he was thrown across the clearing with surprising force a genin shouldn't be able to muster on their own, he was able to see the bells land somewhere around where the genin had started the exam. "Looks like we win, sensei." As Kakashi landed in a three-point crouch in the middle of the field, Naruto took that as his cue to drop down from a nearby tree he had been hiding in. He joined Sasuke and Sakura as they walked over to where the bells had fallen, making Kakashi give the three genin an eye smile. "Oh really, but what are you guys going to do now? After all, there are only 3 bells." Naruto simply gave the man what could almost be considered a genuinely confused expression as he crouched down and picked up the bells, all 3 of them. "What are you talking about, sensei? There's enough here for all 3 of us." To demonstrate, he tossed one to Sasuke before doing the same for Sakura. At that, Kakashi blinked, before remembering the bell Naruto had so casually tossed away at the start of the exam. Sure, Kakashi could call the blonde out on it and say only 2 of them could pass, but then he'd just be forcing the pretense of the test and not acknowledging its subtext. Not to mention the bells were all generically identical, so there was no way to be certain which were his 2. "Well, what can I say, you 3? He let out a small sigh before giving them all one of his best eye smiles, which were pretty much identical to all his other eye smiles. There was only so much emotion you could convey with only a quarter of your face revealed. "You pass." At that, both Naruto and Sasuke let out a satisfied smirk and Sakura did a small dance of excitement. It warmed Kakashi's heart to see how happy it all made them. Quickly enough, he turned his attention back onto the thing now slithering over to Naruto's side. Now that he had a better look at it, and wasn't trying to defend himself against a swarm of poisoned weapons, Kakashi realized quickly enough that it was a puppet. It was a little disturbing though, with the upper torso of a woman, her hair done up in long dreads, and the lower half of a giant snake. It almost reminded him of something he might see in Training Ground 44. Its eyes were completely whited out, giving it a cold, emotionless look. Its mouth revealed a set of long, sharp teeth that gave it a vicious smile when Naruto was so inclined to make it do so. Funnily enough, a puppeteer was one of the few ninja professions Kakashi could never claim to have fought against. That would have been his father. "Naruto, just what is that thing?" Now that their excitement had worn off, both Sasuke and Sakura were looking at the puppet warily as well. Naruto on the other hand was smiling at it, patting the mostly wooden construct on the back fondly. "You like her? I call her Ramia." Kakashi just chuckled nervously at the boy. Who was he to belittle his hobbies? He really regretted not reading those academy reports now. "Well, okay then, as of today we're Team Kakashi." Man, that felt strange to say. "I guess we'll meet back here tomorrow morning at the same time for training and missions." He didn't miss the excited gleam entering all his students' eyes at the mention of missions. The reality, he figured, would be quite the surprise. "Ya nay." With that, he gave a friendly wave before vanishing in a puff of smoke, however, not before he gave a little though to their performance today. It was a rather remarkable display of teamwork for a new team. Maybe he had finally struck lucky. Naruto sighed as he appeared in the tree line after his successful substitution. He had no idea how fast the Junin would be, so he couldn't know if he would get away in time, but he had. A satisfied smirk lit up his face before he made a note of the position he had thrown the bell down. Making sure he had it firmly in his memoir, why he darted off from the tree branch, all the while manipulating Ramia into place so that she would be ready to pounce at the right time. He'd likely waste all of the kunai he had stored in her body, but, well, Kakashi had told them to aim to kill. It didn't take him all that long to find Sasuke, although the boy seemed slightly startled by his sudden appearance. It was remarkable how few people thought to look up when they in turn were looking down on someone. "What do you want, Naruto?" The blonde just grinned as he hopped down onto the branch with the Uchiha, keeping a wary eye on Kakashi from the vantage point. It obviously hadn't been long enough for the man to try something to lure them out. "Good. I'm here with a proposition." Sasuke's eyebrow rose in intrigue, but he said nothing. "Let me guess your plan. You are going to wait until either me or Sakura attacked Kakashi, then use the opening to try and make a dash at the bells, right?" Sasuke's face gave nothing away, but he didn't deny it either, making Naruto smirk. "How about instead, you and Sakura create the distraction? Your taijutsu would be much better for keeping Kakashi busy while Sakura lowers his guard, and I'll be there to swipe the bells when he least expects it. And boy would the Junin not expect him. And then what? Naruto shrugged casually. You and I split the bells, of course. We can both see that Sakura is the weak link here and would only hold us back. Sasuke snorted quietly, not wanted to give away their position. Says the dead last. Naruto gave the Uchiha a deadpan stare for a moment. Please Sasuke, we both know I'm as much a dead last as Shikamaru is. Sasuke's brow quirked at the comparison, but after a moment of consideration he finally nodded. Fine, I'll go along with it for now. If you fail I'll always have an opportunity to go for the bells myself. Never let it be said Sasuke couldn't acquiesce to a better plan with humility. Naruto just patted him on the back with a bright smile. That's the spirit. And with that he vanished into the surrounding forestry again, leaving Sasuke alone to come up with a way of getting the drop on his vastly superior opponent. Sakura nervously bit her thumb as she lay down under a bush, hoping that one of her teammates would attack their sensei soon. The thought of going up against a Junin was daunting, even if she believed Sasuke would find some way of getting the bells. As she racked her brain for some way to be of assistance, Naruto appeared behind her, unable to resist the opportunity to scare his teammate. Hey Sakura. The girl would have let out a shriek of surprise if, in the same movement, Naruto hadn't covered her mouth. Quiet, remember? We're trying not to alert Sensei to our position. After she had given a disgruntled nod to show she understood, Naruto released her. What are you doing here, Naruto Baka? Naruto internally sighed at what he was about to do before allowing a small frown to play over his features. I came to tell you that. I understand. Sakura blinked at that, not quite understanding what the blonde meant herself. I get that at the end of this, only two of us will become a team and… He bit his lip, looking away for a moment. And I don't want to get in between you two. Sakura blinked owlishly at the suddenly bashful boy in front of her. Had Naruto always been like this beneath that hood? What do you mean? Naruto smiled sincerely, or it at least looked that way. I don't want to get between you and Sasuke. I felt terrible if I ended up on a team with him, knowing that you were left behind, unable to pursue your love. Not to mention things would only be awkward if it was us two on a team, alone. A little pink entered Sakura's cheeks at the suggestion. With his hood down and his messy hair falling about his head like that, Naruto looked almost cute. So what? Her voice was slightly meeker than she would have liked it to be, and with a start she realized she could hear the blood pumping in her ears. Naruto just gave another small smile as he began to back away. I already talked to Sasuke about it and we came up with a plan. At the end, you two will get the bells. He chuckled sheepishly as he began to walk away deeper into the forest. All you would need to do is provide a bit of support with kunai or shuriken when you see Sasuke fight Kakashi. He ran a hand through his hair almost bashfully, making the long spikes sway. I guess another year of the academy wouldn't be too bad. With that he took off, leaving a startled and red-faced Sakura behind. Her eyes widened. A few moments later and he appeared on a branch that gave him a good overview of the training ground, still quietly chuckling under his breath. His teammates were going to be so annoyed when he realized he had played them. Maybe they'd be okay after they pass. Still, their reactions would be priceless. Naruto almost felt like skipping home. The feeling of perfectly executing a plan like that was indescribable. He had Ramia safely sealed away in her large scroll, about the size of his forearm, which was concealed in a pocket on the back of his vest, hidden in turn by his jacket. He always had reservations about using scrolls to carry his puppets, as if the scroll got damaged anything within became irretrievable, but there were no better options, so Naruto was forced to learn a bit of the art. If for nothing else, so that he wouldn't have to carry around great big puppets that more often than not were larger than he was. Ramia, for instance, was generally about 7 feet tall when reared up, but she was almost 20 feet in length from head to tail, easily enough to constrict a man, or hide a multitude of weapons. She was currently Naruto's favorite puppet and likely the one he would be using in combat for the foreseeable future, until a better idea came around. Dami was certainly useful for what it was, a glorified mannequin, but he held no real combat capabilities anymore. Ramia, on the other hand, was built purely for that purpose, with every aspect created so she would be as efficient a fighter as possible. But then, Naruto conformed to an ideal of change. If a better idea came along, or he thought of a more efficient system, there were always opportunities to change things. He found himself humming a nonsensical tune as he walked into his apartment, taking a moment to breathe in the heady aroma of brewing poisons, fresh wood and various animal scents. With an uncharacteristic smile he gently tapped the glass of a small habitat box he had built, watching as what at first appeared to be a long, thick stick slowly woke up and reared its head, revealing a long grass snake. "Afternoon, Hisu, feeling hungry?" The snake lazily raised its head at the blonde, flickering its tongue for a few moments before laying back down to sleep. "I guess not." Naruto shrugged as he went about unsealing Ramia. He didn't like to keep his puppets in their scrolls for very long. Hisu, as uninspired as his name was, actually served as the partial inspiration for Ramia. And controlling a puppet's legs was surprisingly hard. However, his first few attempts at creating a human-sized snake puppet had been painfully ineffective. The skeleton of a normal snake just wasn't designed for the load the larger size presented. He still remembered how he had gone about fixing that. A younger Naruto, only 11 years old, walked into the dangoya cautiously. He had been going around the village, asking a few chunin and junin where he might find a giant snake. It would be great if he could find something that already existed in nature to base his puppet off. For whatever reason, everybody he had asked pointed him to this place with a nervous expression. As skeptical as he was that a simple dango hut would hold the answers he was looking for, he had no better leads. Unfortunately for him, the place was almost barren considering the lunch rush was over almost an hour ago. The only people there were the owner and a purple-haired kunoichi. Sighing, Naruto just decided to get this over with. "Hey." Anko looked up from her food and sake, quirking an eyebrow at the runt of a kid looking back at her. Surprisingly, it was actually at her and not her mesh-covered chest. "What do you want, Gaki?" Naruto looked about with a small sigh. "I asked a few people and they said this was the place to go if I wanted to find a giant snake." Anko's brow shot up in amusement as her eyes twinkled in time with the sadistic grin on her lips. "Oh really? And what would a little runt like you be looking for such a dangerous creature for?" Naruto's eyes narrowed at the patronizing tone. "What does it matter to you, ya, exhibitionist?" Anko's eye twitched and a large tick mark appeared over her eye. At least the kid had guts. Her grin took on a sadistic edge. "Well, you came to the right place. You want to know where to find giant snakes?" She fumbled about in her pockets for a moment and Naruto had to wonder how she kept anything with such skimpy clothing. Finally though, she emerged with a pen and paper and began jotting a rough, hasty map that was barely legible. "Here, go to this training ground. You'll find all the giant animals your heart could want." Naruto looked at the childish map disbelievingly for a few moments before shrugging and grabbing it, much to Anko's joy. Almost an hour later the woman emerged from the dangoya, still snacking on her favorite treat with a satisfied smile. Briefly her lips quirked down, feeling a bit of worry for the young kid she had sent into a very dangerous place purely out of irritation. Just as she was resolving to go and find him, or what was left of him, she heard a ruckus down the street. A few civilians were whispering to themselves and with a start Anko quickly realized why. The kid was back, only he wasn't alone anymore. Somehow, he was dragging a snake, longer than twice Anko's height, down the street by the tail. He looked to be struggling with it but just about managing. There were a few rips in his clothes but that didn't seem to dissuade from the excited grin on his lips. As he passed by, he looked up at Anko and gave her a quick salute. "Thanks lady, that place is great." And without another word Naruto kept on dragging the snake back to his apartment. Anko's jaw wasn't working for the moment and she was snapped out of it only when one of the dumplings on her skewer slid off and bounced on the ground. Naruto had meant what he said. Training Ground 44 had turned out to not only be a massive boon to his puppeteering, what with all the giant examples of animals it held, but also managed to launch his training in poisons forward by leaps and bounds. In gratitude to the exhibitionist woman who pointed him in the right direction, he had created Ramia, with the top half of a woman and the bottom half of a snake. Hell, if people were more focused on his puppet's top half than what was firing out its lower half, then all the better. He'd have to find and thank that crazy dango lady one day. The air outside of Konoha wasn't quite what Naruto had expected, it was very plain. Growing up in a city environment, with the hustle and bustle of daily life flowing around him, Naruto had always imagined the outside world to be this great, open, fresh new world. He had felt like training ground 44 was the first step in that direction. Now though, walking along the open dirt path in the direction of Nami no Kuni, he could only be disappointed by the plainness of it all. True, he had spotted a few plants he had never seen before and it had excited him for a while, but now he was just back to the monotony of walking along in silence. They were here because after about a month of pointless chores disguised as missions, and what their esteemed sensei dictated as training, Kakashi had finally deigned to give the group AC rank. It was a hesitant decision as well, but not one that he could argue with. After all, the man seemed to value teamwork above all else, and while Naruto couldn't say what Team 7 had was true teamwork, they could certainly act as a cohesive unit when necessary. It had been when he first got into reading that Naruto realized that the characterization he saw applied in his action novels could very easily be translated over to real life. People had quirks and mannerisms that genuinely affected how they thought about things. They had traits that could be counted on to influence decisions or choices they made. All it took was a slight push in one direction or a tug in the other and Naruto could subtly nudge people in the right way. Of course, this worked better on some than on others. For instance, Kakashi was a naturally cautious man who was very guarded about his own emotions. This made it very difficult to ascertain what traits he had to exploit and even more difficult to manipulate them at all. Likewise, the Hokage's every action and sentence was carefully measured before he said or did anything, as was only proper of a shinobi that had reached his age. Fresh genin straight out of the academy on the other hand? That was child's play. Sasuke was simplicity itself to twist and turn any which way Naruto pleased. It was as if he could see the little blue threads into the boy's mind. Make anything to challenge or question the boy's abilities in an area and the young Uchiha would be on it faster than Tora on a ball of catnip laced with a sleeping drug, long story. Likewise, allow the boy to assume what he believed to be a leading role and he would cruise along a set direction without stopping until he either came across an obstacle or required more guidance. He was stubborn like that. Sakura was an even easier case. Convince her that it was all for the benefit of Sasuke, or her and Sasuke's future, or would help her get Sasuke to notice her, and she'd jump off a cliff. It was almost pitiable in a way, and for a long while Naruto had considered trying to guide her away from that path. Of course he didn't because it was too damn convenient this way, but that didn't mean he hadn't set up measures just in case. Sakura was now coming along quite promisingly in medical ninjutsu, or at least the bare basics of it. Really, show the girl some applicable use of her powerful mind, near perfect chakra control and natural instinct to avoid conflict, and Naruto was surprised Kakashi hadn't already done it. Quite honestly, with chakra control that refined, Sakura could go on to do anything she pleased, from ninjutsu to genjutsu. It was her weak body and rather cowardly nature that left these paths fairly devoid of a hopeful future. It did help that every time Naruto gave a slight compliment on her progress, Sasuke would look over with that same bland look he always did. Of course Sakura would take this to mean that Sasuke was interested in what she was doing, which in turn would push her harder. This was good, as Naruto's own control, while refined, was not quite at the level of medical ninjutsu, although that was something to consider. However, the real story, that was obvious if you weren't obsessed with the boy, was that Sasuke was jealous. The Uchiha hated seeing people his own age surpass him at anything, even if it was something he himself had no interest in. It was the worst, but most exploitable form of a superiority complex. The most hilarious thing about it all though? Kakashi knew what he was doing. Oh, the Junin might not say anything directly beyond a disapproving look, but it was there, in his lazy half-lidded eye. Honestly, Naruto didn't understand his problem. Under normal circumstances Team 7 would be a horrific mess of a team with two quiet loners that were powerful in their own ways and a love-struck fangirl with no mind of her own. If Kakashi wasn't going to take the initiative to mold them into a workable unit, Naruto just decided to take the reins from him. That didn't stop the silver-haired man from trying to undo all of Naruto's machinations, but the man just didn't have the heart to be that manipulative to his genin. He would offer a counter-argument or opinion to the two every now and then, but Sasuke's naturally stubborn nature and one-track mind always kept him on the first course set. Then, naturally, Sakura would follow him, likely into the very pits of Naraka. Although the girl did have a rather large stubborn streak of her own. Naruto suspected it was from the constant praise she received in the academy. Obviously she wasn't used to people criticizing her or second-guessing herself. Naruto simply shrugged to himself internally. Personally, he was rather fond of the arrangement. His plan to gain a good sensei hadn't really gone anywhere considering Kakashi's reluctance to teach them anything that seemed even remotely worthwhile. However, that just meant little had changed since the academy. Everything Naruto had learned about puppetry was self-taught, so why would his time as a genin be any different? And there, he came full circle in his thoughts back to disappointment. Is that kid okay? He's been pretty quiet. Tazuna, the old bridge builder they were assigned to escort back to his home nation, leaned across and whispered to Sakura in a tone he hoped the young blonde couldn't hear. He may have initially been skeptical about 3 kids guarding him, but he still didn't want to upset a shinobi. He'd heard stories. Plus there was this unsettling feeling radiating from the boy as he walked, as if everything going on around him was just background noise to a much greater picture only he could see. It was a hard feeling to describe, but every time those cold, sleep-deprived eyes passed over him, Tazuna felt a small shiver run the length of his spine. Oh, Naruto? He's just, well. Sakura blinked before frowning, looking across at the young blonde trailing behind them in the rear position, a few steps in front of Kakashi. Sasuke was taking point while Sakura walked next to the client. Kakashi had opted for a more lax formation due to the low level of the mission. Well, Naruto's always like this. She rubbed the back of her head and smiled up at the old man in a way she hoped was cute. She was working on that smile for Sasuke after all. You get used to it. Tazuna nodded slowly, not entirely convinced as he felt Naruto's detached gaze slide right past him again. Sure. Well, you seem pretty level-headed at least. Be honest, are you guys powerful? Can you guys protect me? Sakura seemed ready to answer, no doubt lauding Sasuke as she had been for what seemed like the entire trip so far, before Kakashi butted in from the back. I've already assured you client-san, my genin can handle bandits and the like, and that's all we're likely to expect on a simple C rank. Sakura blinked before nodding happily. Bandits, she could deal with that. Just normal people without chakra. Plus, Sasuke would be there to protect her. And with that the girl's gaze drifted off into her own fantasies, leaving a sighing Tazuna and an amused Kakashi looking on. The entire group were fairly lost in their own thoughts, save Kakashi who kept his single eye wandering around, so when they passed a suspiciously wet puddle in the middle of the path, only the silver-haired Cyclops noticed. That was why, when 2 figures melted out of their genjutsu and wrapped up Kakashi in a long chain composed entirely of shurikens strung together, their surprise was apparent. Kakashi-sen. Sakura's cry was cut off when the 2 assailants pulled the chain taut, slicing Kakashi's body into 3 separate bloody chunks. The pinkette froze at the sight, her body going rigid and her mouth dry, the scream dying in her throat. She couldn't even lift a hand to warn Naruto as the 2 darted forward again, wrapping up the surprised blonde and pulling a similar maneuver. Where everyone expected the wet squelch of flesh being cleaved, they were confused to hear the dull thud of metal embedding in wood. Even the 2 assailants looked at the boy in surprise, at least until they saw him smirk at them. Sasuke, now. With a poof of smoke the Naruto in front of everybody transformed into the smooth wooden form of Dami. Sasuke appeared above it, kunai in hand and ready to launch at one of the assailants, now easily identifiable as Karagakure ninja from their headbands. However, as the 2 moved to separate and dodge the assault they found themselves stuck. Looking back, they saw what they first assumed to be some kind of elaborate substitution actually holding the chain. The articulated fingers of the puppet kept a tight grip on the shuriken chain, forcing the 2 to release it from the attaching gauntlets to be free. Damn brats. What the hell's a puppeteer doing here? One of Sasuke's kunai managed to clip one of the missing nin on the arm and Sasuke immediately rushed to pressure him, keeping the man busy with an impressive bout of taijutsu, all the while avoiding the vicious-looking gauntlet. The other attacker turned to look for where Naruto was hiding only to suddenly move out the way as Dami went on the offense. The puppet had gathered up the shuriken chain and was whipping it out at the man who was forced to use his gauntlet to avoid it. However, it quickly became apparent Dami was not a puppet well suited for combat as the attacker managed to duck under a swipe of the chain and lunge forward, cleaving off a whole arm at the elbow and forcing Dami to drop the chain. His confidence that the mannequin was no longer a threat was his undoing, In a smooth motion Dami raised up the stump of its arm and with a quiet pneumatic hiss fired a single kunai. It impacted with an unsettlingly wet squelch right into the man's eye, and just like that, he died. A few meters away Sasuke was still embroiled in a rather intense taijutsu fight. Sweat ran down his forehead from the number of times he was forced to veer off or get poisoned by the gauntlet. He eventually managed to get enough breathing room to flash through a string of hand seals. His opponent dodged out of the way of the telegraphed fireball, but his surprise at a genin managing such a feat kept his mind occupied long enough that he never saw the knee impact with his temple. The entire ambush was over in under 30 seconds. It was quick, it was intense, and it was brutal. Afterwards though, there was a strange calm as the three genin surveyed the battlefield. Naruto dropped out of the tree he had been hiding in, a rather blank look on his face as he stared at the man quietly bleeding out on the floor, dead long before he even hit the ground. Kakashi-sensei, you're okay. Naruto didn't even look up as his sensei emerged from the surrounding forestry. He had seen the man's substitution, it was what tipped him off to perform one of his own. Of course, you don't think an attack like that could get me, do you? No, Naruto didn't look, he just stared at the slowly paling form of the man lying on the ground. This was the first human he had ever killed, indirectly through a puppet or not, and he wasn't sure what he should be feeling. It struck him as odd that he would even think about it. After all, this was supposed to be traumatic, right? He had taken away the life of another living, sentient being. The time he would have lived was gone because Naruto had the capability to take it away, and had. Then why did he feel nothing? Not a flicker of emotion entered his heart. His eyes simply stared forward with the same clinical detachment that he might have had when looking at a dead animal on his workshop table. His eyes picked up the way his joints placed themselves when he fell, the way the blood dripped slowly and steadily from the wound, the way the remaining eye hadn't quite closed so he could still see the widened pupil, perpetually locked in shock. Naruto? The blonde started as Kakashi lay a hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? He blinked once before his usual bored look returned to his eyes. He quickly shrugged off Kakashi's hand but still found himself unable to tear his gaze away from where the man lay before him. Why did he feel so little? Was this normal? Was he normal? I'm fine. Good. There was no catch in his voice. He was confused enough already without tipping off his sensei that something felt wrong. You did what you had to Naruto, that's okay, you know. Naruto finally looked away from the body, a scowl alighting on his features for a fraction of a second. I know, I said I'm fine. Kakashi hesitated before quickly patting the top of Naruto's hood, disliking how it took away his pleasure at ruffling his student's hair. Well, I'm here if you need to talk, Naruto. A ninja's first kill can be hard. Naruto's eyes just narrowed as he continued to look anywhere but at the body on the ground. It wasn't because it disgusted him, or because it brought up nasty emotions. He just thought that if he looked at it again he might not be able to look away this time. He needed something to take his mind off it. They had bounties, right? Kakashi blinked in surprise as he looked down at the young blonde who seemed to have practically forced that out. Huh? Naruto's eye twitched as he pointed at the dead body without looking at it. Bounties, they're missing Nin after all. The demon brothers if I remember right. Kakashi hesitated before a small smile crept onto his lips. Every shinobi had their coping mechanisms, he supposed. Who was he to balk at being a bit mercenary? You keep up to date with the bingo books? Naruto smirked under his hood, the expression hidden by the shadows. Why so surprised? You gave me my first after all. Kakashi's smile softened slightly at that. You remembered? Naruto scoffed lightly. Please, there are no other shinobi with your stupid hair. I was young, not blind. Kakashi chuckled lightly, ignoring the comment about his hair. You never said anything. Naruto smirked again, feeling rather awkward just standing around having a stupid sentimental talk like this. It was a rather odd situation, what with the dead and unconscious bodies nearby. Neither did you. Kakashi chuckled again and rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Touché. Although to be fair, I had hoped to inspire you with a goal. I never imagined you would pick puppeteering. Naruto shrugged lightly as he took a step away from the dead body. Kakashi took the hint quickly enough. But no, even if these two have bounties, it's too long a walk to the nearest office. It would count as a deviation from the mission and I don't have a scroll to seal them into. Naruto narrowed his eyes at that. He didn't have ceiling scrolls able to carry bodies. They were more complex than ones able to hold puppets. It was something he was going to have to carry around from now on, just for preparation's sake. No, the best we can do right now is send a message back to Konoha to pick them up, Kakashi continued, turning towards Tazuna. But in the meantime, Client-san, I think we need to have a little talk about assigning the correct rank to a mission, don't you agree? Tazuna gulped, suddenly feeling rather uncomfortable under that cycloptic gaze. Despite Kakashi's implications that the mission might end there, mostly as empty threats to Tazuna, they continued on their journey to Nami no Kuni. It was inevitable really. Sasuke would never back down from something like this. The first real challenge outside the safety of the village where he could push his limits. No chance. Sakura was like a sheep following her shepherd and agreed as soon as she knew Sasuke wanted to continue, if not with slight hesitance. Kakashi would never so easily abandon someone like Tazuna, especially after the man's rather sickening sob story. The Junin's catchphrase was basically never abandoning friends. As for Naruto, well, the young puppeteer wasn't giving up this chance for anything. This was his first trip to another town, another nation, a place outside of his home. It was his first opportunity to make connections, to meet people, to begin a network. If there was one thing Akasuna no Sasori was famous for, or, he supposed, infamous for, besides his puppeteering, it was the expansive spy network he was purported to have throughout the entirety of the elemental nations. Naruto had been dying to start one of his own for years, and this was his chance, in a new place that didn't know him, where his existence was a blank slate. Of course, he had no idea how one went about setting up a spy network. But then, he once had no idea how to be a puppeteer either. It would be a trial and error affair, just like everything else. The important thing was the opportunity and, in an oppressed place like Nami that would soon be indebted to their team if they succeeded, the opportunity was like no other. There was also a part of him that was excited about that confrontation back there and longed for more. That was the part he tried to ignore as childish impulsiveness. After said encounter though, the blonde was far more wary of his surroundings, not wanting another attacker to get the drop on them. That was why when Kakashi gave the command to drop, he did so immediately, just as a massive spinning blade buzzed overhead through the mist. It slammed into a nearby tree and it was a miracle the 7-foot sword didn't cleave right through it. Instead a large, muscled man, more imposing than Kakashi's scrawny figure, appeared on the blade, body turned away from them. Well, if it isn't Zabuza Momochi, Nuke Nin from the Mist Village. Kakashi stepped forward, his posture giving nothing away as he casually leaned on one foot. However, before he allowed any of his genin to do anything rash, he subtly raised a hand. Stay out of this one, kids. Zabuza's in a whole other league than those Chunin you fought before. As he turned, his visible eye widened when he noticed a distinctive lack of bright blonde hair. Naruto? A loud chortle came from up in the tree where the large shirtless man had turned his whole body to face them. What amazing genin you have there, Sharingan no Kakashi. Behind the two, Sasuke's eyes widened in visible surprise, his hands tightening around the kunai he was holding. Running at the very first sign of a superior opponent, Zabuza chuckled. Smart, but cowardly. Kakashi frowned. Naruto wasn't the type to simply run for no other reason than to escape, he would have a plan of some kind. But then, what did a genin, no matter how prodigious, hope to help in a battle between two seasoned Junin? Sasuke, Sakura, stay back and protect the bridge builder, don't get involved. With that said, Kakashi slipped his lopsided headband up, revealing the fully matured Sharingan in his left eye. Ah, it seems I get to see the Sharingan in action. Zabuza's gruff voice cut in as mist began to draw in toward the clearing, lowering everyone's field of view. Maybe I should feel honored. Kakashi couldn't waste any more time. He didn't know what Naruto was doing, or if Zabuza had accomplices. He had to act soon. I didn't think you would be so hasty to act, Kakashi. It all happened in a split second to the genin. Suddenly Kakashi was up next to Zabuza, standing on the blade as the two locked kunai. Sparks flew as they tested their strengths, and while Zabuza was physically superior, Kakashi's eye could evaluate every muscle twitch and compensate accordingly. In a moment that reeked of grueling training, Zabuza kicked his sword out from under him, spinning the blade with nothing but his foot until he caught it in his hands. Far from being caught unawares, Kakashi bounced back off the tree to avoid the following swipe across his midsection that would have easily bisected him. In midair he twisted, catching his foot on the hilt of the blade and destabilizing Zabuza before completing the motion and scissor kicking the Kiri Junin in the chest. With an underwhelming squelch, his foot passed through nothing but water as Zabuza quickly substituted himself further into the forest. Kakashi didn't pass up on the opportunity to move the fight farther from his genin and immediately pursued. He easily caught up to the Nuke Nin. Konoha shinobi were unsurpassed in the trees, and their fight was on again. Their arms and legs moved in flurries of motion, sparks flying where Kakashi would have to divert the massive but deadly bulk of Kabikirabochu, Zabuza's sever sword, with a simple kunai. Neither really seemed to have the advantage. Zabuza was stronger and faster, but Kakashi had the predictive abilities of the Sharingan. You know Kakashi, as a missed Anbu, we had a standing order to eliminate you on sight. Hitaki Kakashi, the man who's said to have copied over 1,000 jutsu. Kakashi narrowed his eyes at the man. He was sure there were more than a few of those standing orders. Shame, we had no kind of order like that for you. Guess you just weren't important enough. Instantly the mirth in Zabuza's eyes vanished as his sword swings became more ferocious. The two were forced to separate and, as Zabuza came to land on what appeared to be a solid branch, it immediately broke under his weight. It was only his well-trained ears that let him hear the subtle click of a mechanism. It just allowed him to twist his body and bring his sword in between him and the massive barrage of kunai that had been set loose. With every weapon he deflected he saw the ever-so-slight sprays of purple ichor flicking off them, poison. He huffed thoughtfully as he landed on an actually safe bough, looking across at where Kakashi was staring at him. There's no way you had time to set that up while we were fighting. Kakashi's eyes simply crinkled up in amusement. A strange sight with the blood-red visage of the Sharingan in one. I think you'll find that would be my coward of a student. Zabuza grunted again, stretching his neck as he carefully surveyed his surroundings again, suddenly a lot warier. Interesting trap, for a Gaki. Said, Gaki was currently a few hundred meters away from the fight, crouched in a tree as still and quiet as he was able. Chakra threads ran off his fingers like spider webs, each awaiting the slight vibrations that would warn him a trap needed to be set off. Even here, so far from the fight, it was a struggle not to let his hands shake even for a moment. A light droplet of sweat rolled down the back of his neck and his mouth was uncomfortably dry. This was nothing like the fight with the Demon Brothers. Kakashi was right when he said Zabuza was in a whole other league. The powerful natures of their chakras clashing, the nervousness he felt every time their eyes unknowingly slid over his form, the sheer anxiety of being this close to two forces of nature clashing. It was exhilarating. Naruto was terrified of these monsters, but at the same time he had never felt more alive. To even be a part of this clash felt like a privilege, and he wasn't going to waste a moment of it. To that end, as he felt one of his strings vibrate he carefully tugged it, a simple motion that was normally innocuous at best. His reward was an explosion that rippled through the forest, blowing scattered bark and leaves in every direction. Using the noise from the blast he quickly moved position. There was no underestimating Junin of this caliber and he couldn't allow himself to be found for as long as possible. No, then the surprise would be ruined. Rather annoying kid you got there, Kakashi, Zabuza managed to growl out as he leapt away from yet another explosion. He was intercepted in midair while he was off balance and gained a nasty cut up the arm for it. He landed on the floor this time, figuring it was safer than the rigged tree branches. If only Kakashi let up for a moment Zabuza could get away and deal with the brat. He was moving about, but that wouldn't be enough to save him from a master of silent killing. The silver-haired scarecrow wasn't letting up for a moment though. Every trap was an opportunity taken and they always seemed to be in his advantage. What Zabuza didn't know was that Kakashi knew where every trap was. Once he had figured out it was Naruto, he was able to just about spot the thin chakra threads strewn about. They may have been invisible to the naked eye, but to his Sharingan they had their own light glow to them. Although the masked Junin had to commend Naruto for actually hiding the majority of his threads on the undersides of tree limbs, it made them difficult to spot in the midst of combat. It was this foreknowledge that made Kakashi smirk as Zabuza touched down on the ground. A ripping sound was heard and suddenly Zabuza's footing was taken out from under him as a simple snared trap wrapped around his foot and hoisted him into the air. For a Junin of his caliber it was simple enough to twist his body and sever the line, but suddenly Kakashi was there and the Kiri nin was forced to kick him away, unable to use the sword underneath him. The fact he was so nimble even on his hands made Kakashi frown. Right now the advantage was his, but Zabuza wasn't in the habit of leaving openings. If it turned to a battle of attrition then Kakashi would likely come off the worse for it. Suddenly though that didn't seem to be a problem, as from behind Zabuza a familiar and welcome sight burst from the earth. Ramia, in her snake-tailed finesse, moved like a whip to wrap her long flexible body around Zabuza while he was still upside down. The Junin's eyes widened in absolute surprise, never having expected something like this. Suddenly Ramia's tail was around his neck, the open hole at the end pressed warningly up against his throat. What the? Kakashi landed nimbly nearby, wiping the faintest sheens of sweat from his brow as he covered up his Sharingan again. That's good work, Naruto. Thanks for the assist. After a few moments of silence followed by a quick ruffling, Naruto dropped out of the trees. It was fairly obvious to a trained onlooker he was desperately trying to keep some form of composure as Zabuza stared him down with bloody murder in his eyes. However, in a show of bravado that felt entirely false to the young blonde, he held up his hands, forcing the chakra threads connected to Ramia to become visible. It was a clear warning that Naruto could activate any of the mechanisms with a twitch of his fingers. Sorry about not telling you beforehand, sensei. Kakashi sighed as he looked at his student, wondering just what to do with the boy. It's okay, just try not to do it again. You didn't know what you were getting into with a fight between high-level shinobi. Naruto nodded, he knew that all too well now. It was obvious his traps would have been woefully ineffective had Kakashi not been there acting as a distraction, and even Ramia wouldn't have been enough had Zabuza not already been tired out fighting. Hell, it was likely a miracle it worked as well as it did. Even as Naruto thought this, his hands lowered slightly, and Zabuza took his chance. With an unexpected second wind he suddenly twisted his body down, ducking under the tail. At the same moment a heavily poisoned kunai burst from the tip and the tail moved to constrict around his throat. In the same smooth movement he lashed out with his enormous sword, cleaving Ramia's body clean in two at the waist. Naruto's eyes widened at the very sudden destruction of his favorite puppet, but at that moment he had more worrisome things to deal with. Still in the midst of his maneuver, Zabuza suddenly turned to Naruto, his sword extended, his foot ready to bring him that single step closer to the young puppeteer that would guarantee his death. Then, oddly, Zabuza simply slumped to the ground, two long metal needles sticking out the side of his throat. Naruto, panting heavily from the rush of adrenaline, blinked once, then twice, unable to believe he was still alive. A new figure entered the clearing, bearing strange kimono-like clothing that looked heavy to wear and a simple white mask decorated by a red wave and slit-like eye-holes. Thank you for the assistance. I have been chasing down Momochi-san for quite a while now. Naruto blinked again before snapping out of his near-death trance, a scowl passing over his features. What are you doing? I had him. Kakashi looked across at his student in surprise, unused to Naruto showing this kind of emotion. Although he supposed he could put that up to the high stress of the situation, he was more confused about the outburst than anything. When he looked around he saw Ramia's lower body still standing up. The sections all down the front of the tail were opened up, revealing a gleaming array of kunai waiting to be fired. Had they been, they would have absolutely shredded through Zabuza's body, which would have shielded Naruto due to his bulk. Yes, but you would have likely died in the process. There was no annoyance or irritation in the newcomer's voice, it was smooth and clinical. Immediately Naruto quietened. It was true that Zabuza's forward momentum, even if he had been littered with poisoned kunai, would have carried his blade straight through Naruto's body. You're a hunter nin from Kiri, correct? Kakashi decided to step in before his student got in an argument with such a skilled opponent. That accuracy with Senbon was a difficult skill to learn. The mask figure turned to him, their long black hair swaying slightly. With their androgynous appearance and bulky clothing it was hard to determine their gender. Yes, now if you'll excuse me I had to do my job. The hunter nin was about to reach for the body when Naruto quickly stopped them. Wait, that weapon you used, what are they? The shinobi paused, looking up at Naruto with that blank, emotionless mask before one of the long metal needles slid from their sleeves and handed it to him. "They are senbon." Naruto's eyes narrowed. They clearly were not senbon. Senbon were very thin, long needles used in acupuncture. These were clearly thicker and sturdier than their medicine-based counterparts. However, even looking at them had the gears in Naruto's mind turning. They clearly had greater penetrating power than kunai or shuriken, and they were smaller, so more could be packed into the same area. That meant. If that's all, the hunter nin snapped him out of his thoughts by leaving the question hanging, but Naruto was not done yet. "What about the bounty? I bet a shinobi like Zabuza had a massive bounty and we did all your work for you." At this point Kakashi was growing worried. He could feel the onset of exhaustion from overusing his Sharingan. "Naruto, don't argue with the hunter nin, we need to." Suddenly his exposed eye grew heavy. "Need to?" Naruto's eyes widened as his sensei suddenly lilted over and the blonde was forced to catch the lanky man before he slumped to the ground. When he looked back around, both Zabuza and the hunter nin were gone, making him scowl in irritation. "Well damn." After a moment though, he looked back down at the innocuous needle in his hand and shrugged. "Not a total loss, I suppose." With that he began the inevitably long journey back towards his teammates with his sensei awkwardly propped up by his much shorter frame. If only Rami hadn't been broken, he could just get her to carry him. As it was, he was going to have to collect her pieces and put her back together. He glanced down at the senbon in his hand again. Although, maybe not completely the same. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.